right, now we are recording the second part of Pinchas. And I'll go ahead and share the screen. And what we're doing is we're interweaving some of the themes of Pinchas and the surrounding Torah portions with this information that we're trying to go over about the 3 weeks and the 4 fasts that Zechariah mentioned at the very same time. So while I'm doing the 17th of Tammuz, yesterday and today, on Shabbat, we'll be doing a live stream again at 4 p.m. as usual, but I've invited Keisha Gallagher to come and to present some of the information that she has on these 3 weeks on the fasts. And so we'll team teach on Shabbat, B'ezrat Hashem, and then after that, I'll kick in with some extra information over the next couple of weeks so that we're adequately prepared, not just for this fast that's coming up on Thursday, but that we're adequately prepared for Tisha B'Av, that we can rehearse this year. And then, of course, there's the fast of the 7th month, which is going to be on the 3rd day of the 7th month, the month of Tishrei. The fast of Gedalia, which again, it's a minor fast, but once we know the circumstances surrounding these fasts, I think it helps us to appreciate why this COVID-19 plague, its onset was on the 10th of Tebet. And so the implications going forward 18 months or 30 months, however we want to calculate it, I think it's important that we learn them, not necessarily to say something big is going to happen next year. It may not. But if we go ahead and learn them, no matter what year it is, we'll know the context of them, we'll know the prayer points that go with those fasts, and we can be ready at all times, no matter what. So that's what you're going to see is kind of an interweaving of the 2 things, the Torah portion along with the fast teaching. And like I said, this week I'm focusing on the 17th of Tammuz because 17th of Tammuz is this Thursday. So for those of you who want to fast on Thursday, it's a minor fast, so you're only fasting from sun up to sundown. It's not a full fast like Yom Kippur. You'll have a day or two here to prepare and think about what you might like to do in regard to it. So we've got Pinchas, and there's your scripture references. And just as a review for the Torah portion before we get back into the information on Tammuz, we know that the major event here concerns the idolatry and the sexual licentiousness concerning Baal Peor. It's a god that's introduced by the Moabites with the help of the Midianites. Remember, Balak realized that he couldn't curse Israel, but Balaam taught him that even if we can't curse them, we can entice them to open themselves up to a different sort of attack. It won't look like a battle, but it's much more dangerous than a sword-to-sword battle, because with this rebellion, with this sin that they're going to invite into the camp, we can mess with their very souls. You know, in the New Testament, it tells us, don't fear the person that's able to just kill your body. You should fear the one that's able to take your soul. And this is the exact context of how the Moabites and the Midianites attack. They're not making an immediate attack on the physical body like, say, the Edomites who came out with a sword. Instead, they're using idolatry and sexual enticement, which causes Israel to open its own door, whereas the gate was locked this way. If you can just if you want to get into a house and you want to invade the house and ruin the house, and you know that there's adequate locks on the doors, and then really all you need to do is convince the owner to unlock the door himself. And this is what the Moabites did. They convinced the Israelites to unlock the door themselves by offering the idolatrous meal of Baal Peor, which was then accompanied by sexual immorality. And you can see that in Peor. It comes from Pa'ar, and it means to open wide, to just gape open. And that's exactly what happens here. Sexual licentiousness is a matter of, even in a very literal sense, opening yourself wide to sin. And what it does is it creates a breach. Like I said, you just convince the owner to open the door. With sexual licentiousness, you convince the person to open himself or open herself up to the act of immorality, and then it becomes tied into idolatry. And so once that breach is made with sexual immorality, it's similar to making the breach with idolatry. The idol can move into the house, or in this case, they're out in the wilderness. So we see that the positioning of Zimri and Cosbi, they go right up to the opening of the Mishkan, which is consistent with Baal Peor. He wants you to open wide. He wants to find the weak place. He wants to find the opening to where if he can control that opening, he can control the whole house. And that's the danger that I don't think young people and old people at this stage are really understanding about sexual immorality, where everything the world tells them is that it's okay to engage in sexual behavior outside of marriage. They don't understand the breach that they're making for idolatry. And see, once the idolatry through immorality moves into the breach, now it holds the holy territory. And once someone controls you in a sexual way, and I know the sex trafficking is very much in the news right now, possibly for a reason, but that's how you control someone, to even traffic them. If you control them sexually, then you control the whole body, you control the mind, and it does a lot of damage. And young people don't realize how much damage sexual immorality is doing in their lives in terms of opening wide to the evil forces that can move in there and have lifetime implications. Once that idol's set up in the house, it's hard to get it out. And it takes an extreme act, which is where Pinchas comes in. Pinchas is that extreme act of zeal that can uproot the idolatry that tries to move through that breach of sexual immorality. And his name is a contraction. It's supposed of the word peh for mouth and nechash, which is brass, and it's also related to the serpent. Just like we saw the bronze serpent, it's kind of redundant when you say a bronze serpent, because they share a root word. But the serpent is not always used in a negative or evil sense. Like the blessing of the tribe of Dan was to be able to be a serpent in the way who would bite at the horse's heels, who would cause the pride to fall. The contrast we see in the name, I think there's a great lesson if we compare Baal Peor, which is the enticement to open ourselves wide for sexual immorality and also idolatry. In Pinchas' name, we see a mouth that is immovable. It's strong. It's like brass. He's not going to open his mouth. And see, the enticement began with a meal. And it's very vile what would follow that meal. You wouldn't want to eat. And I don't know how eating and that particular act go together, but it would definitely be a turnoff for most people. At any rate, he's not going to eat this meal that the Moabite or the Midianite women are enticing him to come eat. And that's typically how it starts. Last night we talked about the danger of the party, how partying, how just a drop or two too much wine or alcohol can take you past the grape line to where you drop your I'm going to say your pants, although that's kind of what's happening, where you drop your defenses, all right, that keep your pants up in those situations. And that's why it's taught there in the context. The Nazir is taught in the context of the woman accused of adultery. So it's defensive. Pinchas is someone who is not only on the defense, not letting that meal go in that would introduce idolatry and therefore would introduce the sexual immorality. We see that he actually rises up and goes on the offensive in order to uproot not just the couple who were performing the act in front of the opening of the Mishkan, he's uprooting the idol from the holy place, which is going to have implications when we get to the scripture from Daniel about an abomination being set up in a holy place. This is one way that an abomination was set up in front of the Mishkan. And the next step would have been to go beyond the door. The opening was there, Moses and Aaron and Eleazar are sitting around crying. And so in absence of resistance, the idol could have been moved, or even the sex act could have been moved into the holier places. But Pinchas is not going to allow this breach to be entered. He's not going to allow the sexual sin, and he's not going to allow the enemy to enter the Mishkan in that way. So his zeal is held up as a positive thing because he's protecting the opening to the Mishkan. He's repairing a breach of holiness. And these were the points that I recommended to last night's class. If you don't want to take the time to learn everything there is to know about the history surrounding the 4 fasts of Zechariah, this would be the short version, right? This would be your Facebook version, probably, is what I would call it. It's just a nutshell encapsulation of what it is that was catastrophic that happened on that particular date in Israelite history. Right, so you can go back and do that later. And we're going to progress because we want to keep working through Tammuz. Last night, for the newer students who weren't familiar with the Hebrew calendar, I went over a page, which would have been this month, out of the calendar to show you how to look for the Gregorian date versus the Hebrew date. Went over a little bit about the naming, but we're going to let Keisha, when she comes in on Shabbat, she's got a very good presentation that explains why those Babylonian names are still attached. And then I went over it. I just kind of touched over it. So let's catch up to where we were last night. All right, so we know that the 17th of Tammuz, which this year it's on this Thursday, and that's the 17th of Tammuz. And it commemorates more than one thing. We remember it primarily because the walls of Jerusalem were breached by the Babylonians on that date in history. But before that, there was another kind of breach. And it relates to the golden calf. Remember, Moses has gone up the mountain. They've received the 10 words. And now Moses has gone up the mountain. He's going to receive the tablets, the sapphire tablets, with the commandments on them. And these were inscribed by the finger of God, it says. So as he comes down the mountain, he and Yehoshua realize what's happened with the golden calf. And we know that Moshe breaks those particular tablets that were graven by the finger of Adonai. And so the difference between the way the Israelites were looking at the commandments, such as thou shalt not commit idolatry, thou shalt have no other gods before me, it's the same problem we have today. The world has been conditioned to look at the Torah as bondage, and not being bound by the Torah as freedom. The message of the 17th of Tammuz is that you have to flip that paradigm in order to understand what the significance of that day. And we get this commentary that says, graven up on the tablets from Shemot 32:16. It says, I think that's right. If the first tablets had not been broken, the Torah would never have been forgotten in Israel. And then Rabbi Ben Yaakov says, no nation or tongue would have had any power over them, for it says graven. Read not graven, charut, but freedom, cherut. And then it goes on, Rabbi Khan comments on this particular passage, and he says, if the Jews had not built this golden calf, then the Torah would have been received in a much more organic way. It would have been graven upon their hearts and minds, because they would have received it as the freedom from death and the freedom from sin and the freedom from confusion that was intended. But instead, because they saw it as bondage instead of freedom, they could only receive it like stone tablets. And so on the 17th of Tammuz, that's one of the prayer points we want to examine, is what is my attitude toward the commandments? Do I see them as that perfect Torah of liberty, as James described it, or do I still see it in any way as some sort of bondage? And if you feel like you're pretty good on that point, which I suspect this class is, then that would definitely be a prayer point for the world, and specifically for our loved ones, for people we work with, for people of faith. We want the 17th of Tammuz message to go out into the world on Thursday. It's not bondage, it's freedom, it's liberty. And so we pray that as we keep these commandments as part of our walk, that each one we keep, we would be able to see the freedom in it, even when it feels like it's very limiting, that we would understand that there's life and freedom in it, as opposed to death and bondage. Okay, let's see. Another prayer point. Remember, the Babylonians breached Jerusalem's city walls on the 17th of Tammuz. Now there's other sources, and I believe it's in Jeremiah, that says it's on the 9th of Tammuz. So there's discrepancy between the 9th and the 17th. I don't think it's a discrepancy. I think it's once you've stood in those ancient cities and you've seen the size of the walls, and you realize that they didn't have bulldozers, they didn't have backhoes, they didn't have cranes. It was very difficult. Even if you did breach the wall, you would have a lot of additional work to do in order to destroy the walls and to get an army through that breach. Because once you have a breach, I don't know if you're familiar with, just basic tactics of breaching a room, but if you go in one at a time, and the defender has arrows or guns or whatever the defender is using on that breach, then they just pick you off one by one as you walk through the breach. So just breaching it, it's going to be a time period that's going to lapse between just breaching, making that opening, and then enlarging the breach so that you can get sufficient numbers of of fighters through there to continue the fight. So our prayer on that day, I think, is that if there are breaches of confusion, because remember, Babylon represents confusion, that if there's any breaches of confusion in our life, that we would be repaired, that we would walk along our own walls and look for breaches or weak spots or soft spots in that wall, or maybe just spots where we can enlarge the wall. You know, the more we pour the word into a particular area of our lives, the thicker and the more solid that wall will be against the Babylonian confusion. And remember what I said about how the idol works. It entices you to open the door so that you will create a breach. And once the enemy, Babylon, goes into that breach, just like you could see the plan in Pinchas, if I can get this far and commit this act in front of the opening of the Mishkan, then my next step is to move inside and set up an abomination inside the holy place. Well, it's the same way with Jerusalem. Once they pour into Jerusalem, then they're going to erect a tower of confusion. They're going to erect a high place of confusion within that city. And I think that's where we get this name of Mystery Babylon. And it's difficult for that tower of confusion to be torn down once it's erected. Once it's set up, it's extremely difficult to uproot it. It's much easier to take good care of your walls than in hindsight to go back and try to remove that breach and that tower of confusion that's been set up. So we can pray for that. So here's from the Mishnah that explains to us in more detail than Zechariah about why these would be fast dates, because Scripture doesn't always give us a complete historical breakdown. It might be brief or it may not be there at all. It just may pop up in Zechariah, and all we've got is the bare bones. And so I think this year, if you're just now learning about the fast, then you start with the bare bones. And then next year you'll have a foundation to build upon. These are the important things to know about the 17th of Tammuz, or the 17th of the 4th month, right? First of all, remember Moses broke the tablets because of the golden calf. They had opened wide and let an abomination be erected among them. Number 2, in history, the Tamid offering was ended in the temple on this date. Number 3, in history, the city walls were breached of Jerusalem. And that's going to happen twice. Number 4, a Greek named Apostomus burned the Torah scroll of Ezra. And some other sources will tell us he didn't just burn the Torah scroll of Ezra, that he burned any Torah scroll he could possibly find. And that's really the plan. Once they get into the breach of the city and they set up in the city, then they're trying to wipe out the memory of the Holy One. And that's one way that you do it, is you burn anything that might have his name on it. And 5th, there was an idol placed in the temple courtyard. And so when we look at the 17th of Tammuz, this Thursday, what we're entering into is the beginning of the 3 weeks of mourning for the destroyed temple. And is it appropriate for us to mourn too? Absolutely. We're part of the temple. We're being fitly joined together as the temple. Plus, we have a personal temple, the temple of our body. And the fact that we are still in an exile, that we're still living in a world of confusion, and that we cannot go up to the temple to worship, that is still a cause for mourning. that Messiah is still waiting to get the word to gather us together to Jerusalem. And there's another tradition concerning the 17th of Tammuz, when Moses comes down and he breaks the tablets. It's understood that those tablets were on sapphire stone. And the tradition tells us when the holy letters saw the golden calf, because remember, they were written by, it says, the finger of God. When those holy letters saw the golden calf, that they ran away. They ran back to heaven. It's just like, no, we don't want to go down there with the golden calf. That's wrong. And the letters ran away. We don't know if that's literally true or if this is part of a midrash to help us understand how holiness will flee from sexual licentiousness and idolatry, just like Joseph ran away from Potiphar's wife. He didn't walk, he ran away. And so to this day, he's known as a symbol of purity in Israel, sexual purity. And so in the same way as these holy letters fled, the tablets, when they saw the golden calf, you draw that line to Jerusalem and the behavior of Israel, the behavior of Judah that caused the holy presence to flee the holy city. And all that left was these broken physical walls. There was no spiritual wall around them anymore, because they had opened that breach long ago with their idolatry, their murders, and their sexual licentiousness. And so all they had left was physical walls. And to a kingdom like Babylon, a physical wall is just a little bump in the road. But if you have a spiritual wall, now you have a true defense. But because of their behavior, because of their idolatry, the holiness, the presence of Adonai fled. And what was going to happen then? They were going to be chained to Babylon. And we're still chained to Babylon, by the way. That mystery aspect of Babylon, where they moved in and they established strongholds of idolatry within the holy city. There is still within the holy city strongholds of mystery Babylon, of idolatry, of sexual licentiousness, and of murder, of hatred against brothers and sisters. So another prayer point for this day. We want to pray that that holy presence will return to the living stones, to the people of Jerusalem who were willing to mourn for its sins. And it's a challenge sometimes when the scripture asks us to repent for sins that don't really belong to us, they belong to our ancestors. And so it's not necessarily that he's punishing for sins that aren't ours, it's that we're suffering the consequences of their sins, and we would like for that bondage to also be broken. That we would acknowledge the sins of the past so that it would remind us not to repeat those sins in the future, and to even examine our lives, constantly to see if we're opening up a breach. And it's your mouth that lets the stuff in. And that's when we get Pinchas, the brass mouth, unmovable. Well, the sin of Baal Peor didn't start with a sex act. It started with a meal. It's the same thing with the golden calf. What did the people do? They sat down to eat and drink, and then they rose up to play. And so we want to pray that Israel be found worthy to ascend to the land of Israel, which was the plan before the golden calf entered in, was that they would enter into immortality. They would move from Sinai to the land. There would be very little resistance because they would have the supernatural help of this hornet or this locust or this bug, whatever it is, called the tzila. He's actually promised through Moses that when it was time to go into the land, that he would wipe out all these ites, the Hivites and the Amorites and so forth. He says, I'm going to send my hornet before you. And so he's even going to harness the bugs of Abaddon. And that's what could have happened on the next fast, which is the 9th of Av. When the spies come back and they give the evil report, then there was no reason to unleash the bugs to go ahead of them to clear the way. Because at that point, that probation that they had been on since the golden calf was revoked. And he said, you will not enter into the land in this generation, and you're not going to enter into the immortality that could have gone with it. I'm sorry, baby. I know. So a review of the 5 events that begin the 3 weeks of mourning for the destroyed temple. And on this slide, I made some notes to some of them, like number 3, where the city walls were breached. Like I said, there's a discrepancy on the date in some sources, but we can reconcile those by remembering how the walls of Jerusalem worked. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know that it's just a maze of walls, broken walls, and rebuilt walls, walls on top of walls. You can often tell a time period based on where the changes in the wall are, you can spot them. And then walls would fall, and then they would take the old walls and rebuild with the same stones. So, like I said, it's possible that the outer walls could have been breached, and I'm going to give you a picture on the next slide so you can see how that works, and a scripture that references how that works. So you could have breached the outer wall on the 9th of Tammuz, and then the wall of that temple area on the 17th that would have allowed access in there for that destruction. And then I want to look at a modern event, not necessarily a current event, but a modern event that shows the same timeline. How there was an event that happened with the same number of day separations. And then Apostomus burning the Torah. He was a Greek official in the Second Temple era. So that gives you a historical date on that. And then when the idol was placed in the temple courtyard, there were multiple dates. This didn't happen just once. When we read about an abomination that causes desolation, this is not a one-time event. Some sources point to the idol that was erected by King Menashe in the First Temple period. Then we know that there was difficulty with the same problem with the Greeks and with the Romans before the final destruction of the Second Temple. And so you can read more about that if you're a Talmud reader in the Jerusalem Talmud in Ta'anit 4:6. So here's an example. And I know that looks like a modern building, and it is. It's a very modern building that you see out there in the back. But what you see below there, that jumble of rocks, is actually the ancient wall that was built to keep out the Babylonians. And they weren't really sure what, this was a surprise to the archaeologists when they found it, but how they dated it, it forced them back to the book of Isaiah. Because in Isaiah 22:7-11, it says, "Then your choicest valleys were full of chariots, and the horsemen took up fixed positions at the gate, and he removed the defense of Judah. In that day you depended on the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches in the wall of the city of David were many." Right, so now it's talking about those breaches in the wall. It says, "You collected the waters of the lower pool. Then," and this is how they dated this wall, "you counted the houses of Jerusalem and tore down houses to fortify the wall. and you made a reservoir between the two walls for the waters of the old pool. But you did not depend on him who made it, nor did you take into consideration him who planned it long ago. So there's a couple of ideas in here. We can see the extra wall that they built to keep out the Babylonians. And that key piece of information right there is they tore down houses to make that wall. And when they excavated this particular wall, what they found was it had literally, in some places, been built out of torn down houses. In other words, the houses were in the path of where they wanted to build this extra wall. And so rather than build the wall around the house so that it wouldn't destroy the house, they just took the right of way and destroyed the people's homes and used the stones to help build the wall. And so there's an irony there, that I had to tear down the houses of Jerusalem in order to build a wall against the Babylonian enemy. And so once they realized how old this wall is. And so even though it's surrounded by modern buildings, you can see this little section that's been excavated. And that tells you that this is part of that wall that was breached. And it tells you that there was more than one, which I think helps us account for why would it say it was breached on the 9th, and then why would it say it was breached on the 17th? Well, you can see there were multiple walls, and there were also fragments and remnants of walls, because if you compare the city of David, again, with more modern walls, it wasn't just there was a nice, clean line around Jerusalem. It was a big jumble of stuff. So I thought that might be a little bit of interest to you, that things are not always as cut and dried as we tend to make them in hindsight. One of the other things that happened on this date, the Tamid, which means perpetual, ongoing, which is an Olah offering, was discontinued on the 17th of Tammuz. The Jerusalem Talmud says that as the destruction of the second temple neared, there weren't any more sheep for the Tamid offering because of the siege. And so, and this is kind of strange how ancient wars went on, because we know that there were certain rabbis that escaped Jerusalem, made deals with the Romans and so forth. They would let people out to bury the dead each day. It wasn't that the city was locked up tight. There was apparently a little exchange that went on each day. And so what would happen every day is the Jews would send gold to the Romans in exchange for 2 sheep. But on the 17th of Tammuz, I guess the Romans had had enough, and they sent pigs instead of sheep. And that's when the Tamid offering was discontinued. And again, that's in the Jerusalem Talmud. Why is this important? Well, not only is it a daily offering, it's an Olah offering. And that offering represents resurrection. It represents going up. And so this expectation, this daily sacrifice that foretells the resurrection of the dead, ceased. The burning of the Torah. Postumus was a Greek official during the Second Temple, and the particular scroll or sefer that he burned was supposedly the one that Ezra had written. He was one of the men of the Great Assembly. And by the way, if this sounds very historical, but you don't have this background, I'm going to go ahead and promote a couple of good books, Becky books, both written by Rabbi Krieger, to help get your mind around some of these fasts and so forth. Her book on the Hebrew calendar, Day by Day, is very good just for a concise overview and reference book. And the same thing with her little booklet on Introduction to the Jewish Sources. if you don't know the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud and the Mishnah and so forth, you don't have to read a textbook. She's done a really good job of making that information concise, putting it in a historical setting, and just making it easy to give yourself that background. But anyway, she describes the men of the Great Assembly and Ezra's role there. But Ezra's scroll was the one that was used for the scribes to copy a new scroll, a new sefer. It's called a sefer, is a book. And so when they wrote the new ones, they had to have a master copy. And Ezra's was the master copy from which all the new books of Torah were written. And then, like I said, some opinions said that he tried to burn all of them that he could find because he wanted to abolish the Torah from Israel. And so if you'll compare this to what we learned about the 10th of Tevet, and that's the fast that it doesn't just mark when the siege of Jerusalem began. Built into that is a sense of mourning, because that was the date that the Hebrew Torah was translated into another language. And they lamented the fact that the purity of the Hebrew words would now be subject to translation into the garments of the Gentiles. In other words, the words could be twisted and lose some of the power in the meaning once it went into another language. So it had a good side, but then it also had the side that we struggle with, which is, what do these words actually mean? And they're not everything translates properly from one language to another, and definitely not from one culture to another. So the 17th of Tammuz commemorates the loss of this Hebrew master document. And then finally, the idol that was placed inside the sanctuary, which has happened more than once. But there was an idol that was placed in the sanctuary on the 17th of Tammuz. And again, you can go into the Talmud and read the discussions regarding the timing of that particular event. But one opinion says it was also done during the Greek era by this same Apostomus. And then they again point all the way back and say the precedent was by the Judean king, King Menashe, during the first temple. So it was something that was done repeatedly on the 17th of Tammuz. And that should be ringing some bells in your head right now. Let's go to Daniel 12:9. And we're not date setting. We're simply looking at a pattern that, again, when we look at these fasts, we don't necessarily say, I'm going to learn these fasts because, the end of the world's going to come in 2021. That's not what we say. We say, I'm going to learn these fasts so that no matter what year it is, I will know what my fasting and prayer points are, and I will be prepared no matter what comes next year. That's the way to think about this. So Daniel 12:9, he said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined. And that's good news. He's putting the good news first, that there will be people who will love the Torah, who will work on their relationship with the Holy One. And through these words, many will be purged, purified, and refined. But the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand. In other words, those who are truly and completely wicked will be unable to grasp this. We say, what is this? I think one of the thises that we're talking about is the fast dates that are set up in the Word. Now, it doesn't mean that they would understand everything we're going over, but at least for those who are purged, purified, and refined, there would at least be an acknowledgement when they read that passage of Zechariah. They might say, well, I don't even understand what that means. I don't even know what the Hebrew months are, but I believe God's word is true. I think that sort of faith is accepted, and it can be refined. I think that's why he's raised us up in these days. We have Jewish brothers and sisters who have a really good grasp on these dates and the history that goes with them. And then we realize that through Zechariah, these dates are prophetic. And then we become the bridges who can explain to others who don't even know how to use a Hebrew calendar to say, look at these dates. And let me explain just a little bit of background and why it might be important for you to pay attention to the basic concepts that go with these fasts. And he says, none of the wicked will understand. They just won't. It'll be like you are speaking a foreign language to them, because they will not acknowledge the authority of God's word. He says, but those who have insight will understand. So I think for the righteous, if you say it is written in Zechariah, blah, 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 with these 4 fasts, they would at least agree in principle that God's word is true and eternal, even if they don't get the details. But there will be a people, he says, who will have insight and who will understand these dates, that will understand these events. He says, from the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. Now, because you have a background and you understand that the regular sacrifice, the tamid, is an olah offering, and it prophesies of the resurrection, we realize that it's contextual with what Daniel's being told to do. You're going to enter into your rest, you're going to die, but he says you're going to rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. And so he mentions 2 things here that very particularly apply to the 17th of Tammuz, the 17th of the 4th month. And so he says, from that time, which we know is the 17th of Tammuz, Daniel, you can calculate out 1,290 days, but then he doesn't really say exactly what's going to happen on day 1,290, but he says, you will be blessed if you will wait and attain to 1,335 days, which tells me something will happen on day 1,290 that would make you think you can't make it. That would make you think, well, this is the end. And he says, on that day, don't think it's the end. Keep waiting and keep expecting until the 1,335th day. So I'm going to give it to you math whizzes who are out there to do that calculation from the 17th of Tammuz. Let's say this year, we could just use this year as an example. I'm going to let you go in. I'm going to do it too. I'm going to go pull up the calendar later, and I'm going to try to calculate that out and see where it lands on a calendar, just for kicks and giggles. But in both those dates, to see if there's any significance there. And I guess if it's not in our generation, then it wouldn't have any significance, other than just something to keep learning and preparing for. But in terms of the resurrection, he really is giving us strong information. And he's telling us that this 17th of Tammuz, which he's not specifically stating it, you just have to know, and the only people who would really know anything about this for century after century would be Jews. They would be the only people who would have any interest or insight into the 17th of Tammuz, because they kept preserving it as a fast date. And they would know that the Tamid was abolished on that date, and that the abominations of desolation were set up on those dates. So these two events go back to the golden calf debacle. Remember, that's the origin of the calamity that seems to continue happening on the 17th of Tammuz, that there's a breach that's going to introduce sexual immorality, that's going to introduce idolatry and murder. Go back to last night's lesson and you'll hear more about the murder aspect that also was attached to the golden calf. But this particular date counting was revealed to Daniel. And what do we know about Daniel? He's the person who's known for his ability to fast and pray. It's a small book of Daniel, but look how often he was found fasting, and his prayer habit was so strong, it actually ended up with him in the lion's den. And it's not insignificant that he would be thrown into the lion's den, because the lion was iconic of the kingdom of Babylon. I found a really great picture of the lion on the Ishtar gate that I'll probably put in next week's presentation so that you can see it. So it represents all the strength of the king when you look at the Babylonian lion. And Daniel is thrown into a pit full of these Babylonian lions, and they don't harm him because he controls his walls. Even though he's no longer in Jerusalem, that's, our prayer point. Make me like Daniel. Show me how, through prayer and fasting and moral behavior, to maintain my walls intact so that there are no breaches from Mystery Babylon and its culture, and so that that lion cannot harm me. But the point I wanted to make with that passage out of Daniel, because it's used so many times for people trying to calculate dates of destruction and so forth. And one thing that seems to be consistent is they're always wrong. If they set a date, up to this point, they've been wrong. And so we don't want to do that. What we do want to do is learn this particular date, the 17th of Tammuz, and to realize if we just read the text the way it's written, Daniel is not saying we have to literally see an abomination set up in the temple. We don't literally have to have a Tamid sacrifice that is stopped. We can take what we already know about the 17th of Tammuz, and these principles could still apply without even a literal temple built on that spot. You can still calculate the dates, the days that he gives you, if you start at the 17th of Tammuz. So he says, you can know a time based on these events because of what we associate with the 17th of Tammuz each year. You know what's happened in the past, and therefore you will have a way each year of looking toward the future. You won't know if it's the year or not. Yeshua said, it's not for you to know the times and the epochs that the Father has fixed. But he's giving you a path of expectation every year if you fast on those dates of the 3 weeks, or the straits as they're called. The wicked or the rebellious person would remain unaware of those dates. And you say, what about my Christian friends? They don't pay any attention to this part of the Bible. And I would say, that's why you're here. You can take this same information and you can teach them in probably a much more elementary way, but you can still teach them that these things run in cycles, and it never hurts to be prepared. If we're into prepping, this is the proper type of prepping we should be doing every single year through prayer and fasting, like Daniel, so that Mystery Babylon is not going to be able to enter any breaches in our personal wall, that the Holy Spirit will not flee away because it sees us playing with idolatry, with sexual licentiousness, or murdering people with our tongues. Those sorts of things can just grieve the Spirit until it withdraws from us. And so here's just an example of the pattern. This is from 2014, July the 7th. Is that today? Is it today, July 7th? I think it is. Yes, it is. Today's July 7th. So 6 years ago, on July 7th, it was also the week of Torah portion Pinchas, which is one of the points we were making last night, that you can know that certain Torah portions are going to fall around these fasts every year at specific times, so that you know the themes you're supposed to be looking at in your prayer life as you mourn the destruction of the temple and pray for the restoration of the people, of the living stones. So in that year, it was the week of the Torah portion, Pinchas, and it's going to be 1 week before the fast of Tammuz. And it's separated by the same number of days that we have the disparity in whether the wall was breached on the 9th of Tammuz or whether it was breached on the 17th. Well, we get that same separation of days on that calendar. So on the 9th of Tammuz in that year, which was July 7th, and I put a little fire icon on there so you could differentiate it. That's when they tried to burn Joseph's tomb in Shechem. Torah portion, Pinchas. And then you see in the next week, a week later, you have the fast of Tammuz on the 17th. So you have an equal number of days there as we have the disparity between the 9th and the 17th as days of breach. All right, so why would they want to burn Joseph's tomb, which they've tried to do that repeatedly, by the way. I'm just pointing out one particular time that they did it because it does line up with this cycle. The point is, it was in Shechem that the Egyptian exile really began. Remember, Joseph is sent to check on his brothers who were tending sheep at Shechem. And the Babylonian Talmud and Sanhedrin 102a reminds us, Shechem was a place predestined for evil. It was in Shechem that Dinah was abused. And that's where a mass murder took place. Remember, Shimon and Levi took up arms, and on the 3rd day of the circumcision, they go in there and they wipe out the city of Shechem. So in Shechem, Dinah was abused, and Shechem, Joseph's brothers sold him to the Midianites and the Ishmaelite traders. And then it was in Shechem that the kingdom of the house of David was divided. Remember, the northern kingdom, that's where they set up their capital, in Shechem. So we've got a familiar pattern that's popping up. We have sexual sin with an idolatrous Gentile. We don't know how old Dinah was. We don't know exactly what happened in the situation, but Shechem did violate her. in a sexual way, and they were idolaters. We see the mass murder because of Shimon and Levi. They're going to defend her honor and the honor of the family. We saw that also with the golden calf, that the Levites had to take up arms against their own brothers, and they had to slay the ones who had committed idolatry with the golden calf and the sexual sin. And then we see hatred against brothers. Those are the three things, remember, that tradition tells us destroyed the first temple. Those particular three things. And so we can see, just like it tells us that Amalek's memory needs to be cut off in every generation, in the same way that Pinchas is cutting off the sexual sin of Zimri. He's wiping out that name. And so Amalek tries to do the same thing. Amalek is very much trying to destroy the memory of Israel in every generation. Just like burning the Torah scroll. If I can burn the Holy One's name, then I can be God. That's the mindset. And so Amalek, his goal, of course, is going to be to try to unlink Israel's descendants from their attachment to the land of Israel. There's been an ongoing campaign for thousands of years to unlink the descendants of Abraham from that promised land. And in this particular case, in 2014, we see that spirit of Amalek working, trying to burn Joseph's tomb. Again, if we can destroy his name and his attachment to the land, and Joseph was very clear, take my bones to Israel. Do not leave me in Egypt. If they can destroy the tomb, then it's part of, they don't even know what they're doing, by the way. They think they're in a tit for tat. They're not. The spirit of Amalek is working, trying to unlink the promise to the descendants of Abraham from that particular land. So let's see if we can find more of this Pinchas connection to Tammuz 17 and Shechem. And I'm going to read from John 1, 43 through 51. It says, the following day, Yeshua wanted to go to Galilee. And he found Philip and said to him, follow me. Now Philip was from Beit Saida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael, and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Yeshua of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. And Nathanael said to him, can anything good come out of Nazareth? Philip said to him, come and see. Yeshua saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. Remember that word deceit. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? Yeshua answered and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Yeshua answered and said to him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, most assuredly, I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. So Nathanael, there is something that Yeshua says that makes Nathanael just kind of, completely change his attitude from, well, can anything good come out of Nazareth to, you're the King of Israel. And so he acknowledges Yeshua's authority in Israel. So we want to try to unpack why. Deceit is dolos. It's in the Greek 1388 in Strong's. It's Hebrew cognate, which I've shown you how to do now. If you get down into the the Gesenius lexicon, it'll typically give you a Hebrew cognate if there is one. The cognate to dolos is mirma, which is the Hebrew 4820. So I want to give you a context for when this particular word was used. And if Yeshua is speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, it's possible that Nathanael picked right up on this particular word. And it says, but Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit, mirma, because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. Now, why would Nathanael made a connection here? Well, it goes back into the traditions. That's why it's good sometimes to check the Midrash. What sorts of things were being said in the Jewish world about particular Torah portions? We know in the tradition that the actions that Pinchas took against Zimri and Cosbi, they were seen as directly related to that incident hundreds of years before at Shechem. Because of the zeal that Pinchas had, the same kind of zeal for the house of Adonai that Shimon and Levi had for the house of Jacob. And so when Pinchas defends the honor of the Mishkan against sexual licentiousness and idolatry, then it's directly compared to the zeal that Shimon and Levi exercised when they didn't just defend their sister Dinah's purity, her sexual purity, but also the family's honor against idolaters. And so in this particular case, even though on his trip out of the land, Jacob saw the ladder opening up into heaven and the angels ascending and descending upon it, when he returns, it's two of his sons who have the greater zeal for the holiness of the land. Now, did they jump out ahead of their father in this? They definitely did. Did the punishment fit the crime? I don't know. Not for me to judge. But they say it's the same type of zeal for the holiness and the purity of the land and maintaining those walls of purity. And so Yeshua sees Nathanael, and he's telling him in kind of a Jewish language here, you have the same type of zeal for Israel that Pinchas had. You have the same type of zeal, and here comes the door repairman, that Shimon and Levi had. And so when Philip tells Nati that Yeshua is from Nazareth, remember, it's only 6 kilometers from Sepphoris, and it's a Roman stronghold. And it was built up even before Herod Antipas, but during his reign, it turned into a completely Roman loyal stronghold. And Nathanael just cannot control his contempt because of the sexual licentiousness that was attached to the Roman culture there. It even had a big theater. And he's doubting that anything can come out of this idolatrous culture that has influenced the city of Sepphoris. We're going to go on pause for just. Okay, so what is he talking about the fig tree here? When he answers Nati, we have this proverb about a fig tree in Proverbs 27:18. It's traditionally connected to the Torah portion Pinchas because it involves Yehoshua. Joshua, Yehoshua sounds a whole lot like Yeshua. You're just dropping a syllable out of it. But here's what the proverb says. It says, he who tends the fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who cares for his master will be honored. And if you would read the entire chapter of Proverbs 27, you would see the entire chapter has context in Pinchas and the different themes of Pinchas. But this verse is especially mentioned in the Midrash to this Torah portion to describe Yehoshua, Moses' servant, and the succession from Moses, who was the leader, or we'll put in quotation marks, king of Israel at that time, and that being passed to Yehoshua. And it could be that Nathanael was studying this very Torah portion. It's certainly contextual. We don't really know that without the Midrash. But if we do know the Jewish tradition, we can understand that they're speaking a language that they understand, but maybe we don't. And so how it connects, you can see in two subsequent verses after Proverbs 27:18. After it says this about he who tends the fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who cares for his master will be honored, it says, know well the condition of your flocks and pay attention to your herds, for riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to all generations. And so let's look at some of these topics here that continue on in Pinchas. We don't just have the record of Pinchas' zeal for the house of Adonai. We see the tribes are numbered again. The daughters of Zelophehad are given an inheritance with their tribe. In other words, they stop and they check the condition of the flocks. After every tragedy and calamity, it seems like they have to recount to see who's left. So they check the condition of the flocks. And then Zelophehad's daughters bring up a national question. Moses was told to ascend Mount Nebo and to look at the land of Israel, realizing he's not going to be able to enter in. But now he has to know what the manner of succession is. Who's going to come after him as the leader of the nation? There's only two men left with firsthand knowledge of the land. That's Caleb and Yehoshua. He has to be wondering, could it be one of my own sons? Will one of my own sons succeed me? Will it be one of Aaron's sons? Hold on just a second. Okay, so we've got the national question. Who's going to succeed Moses as leader? Is it going to be someone like Moses, more interested in multiple aspects, or is it going to be a Cohen? And remember, the context of that verse in Proverbs is that the crown does not endure to all generations. And this is what Moses has to face. He kind of wears this crown of leadership, but it's not going to be extended to his own sons. Instead, it's going to be extended to Yehoshua. And if we keep reading in the Torah portion, Pinchas, it also tells us about the Tamid offerings, along with others for the special days. But it does go on to talk about the Tamid offering. And what do we know? On the 17th of Tammuz is when the Tamid offering was halted. So again, we're getting deep context here. And like Daniel was saying, there's going to be people that don't understand this. There's going to be people who can't put this stuff together until the end on purpose. So let's go back to Moshe's question. Why didn't he already know that it was Yehoshua? Or why didn't the people already know that it was Yehoshua? Why do we need this elaborate conversation about who should it be? What kind of person should it be? The public ordination, and so forth. But when we look at the history, we see that Yehoshua did lead the battle against Amalek, but it didn't go well. And that's what the spies reported. There's Amalekites in the land. And that was one of the reasons they didn't want to go up. They didn't want to face the Amalekites again. Because even though they won the battle with Moshe's hands lifted in support, if it had just been up to Yehoshua without Moshe, they would have lost. It was not going well. And this might be one of the reasons why the spies had no confidence in going up against the Canaanites and the Amalekites. It might be one of the reasons why at first we noticed Caleb was the one who was speaking up on the 9th of Av, our next fast day. And why at first Yehoshua is silent and only later does he tear his clothes when he realizes the people don't want to go up. He might have been standing there thinking about, oh my goodness, without Moshe, how would I lead these people into battle? How would this battle go with Amalek alone, much less all these other Canaanites? And remember what we learned about the prophecy of Eldad and Medad was that it was Moses would die and Yehoshua would lead them in. Well, Yehoshua hadn't inspired a lot of confidence of his ability to do that without Moshe. So they have this, no, we can't do it. And then they reconsider, they say, yes, we will go up. And of course they don't have Yehoshua with them and it doesn't go well. Again, they're defeated. What do we know about Yehoshua? He was Moshe's servant. He remained with Moshe as long as Moshe lived. And it was Moshe himself who led the wars against Sihon and Og. And so with all this background in mind, now we can understand why Moshe is praying in this portion that says Moshe spoke to the Lord saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be as sheep that have no shepherd. So there's our sheep again. So his request is dual. First of all, they need a leader in war, one who goes out and comes in. Second, he wants that leader to have a shepherd's heart, not just a man of war, but also a man with a shepherd's heart. And so the answer to this request is that the Holy One tells Moshe, that person is Yehoshua, your faithful servant. And he says, at his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the people of Israel with him, the whole congregation. He's capable of leading in war even without Moshe once he's been ordained. And once some of that wisdom and spirit of Moshe is placed upon him, it will be enough. And he also has the shepherd's heart. And so according to the Midrash, the Holy One answers this request for a successor with a shepherd's heart and the zeal for battle with this particular verse that we've quoted. He who tends the fig tree will eat its fruit, and he who cares for his master will be honored. And this is in the Midrash to Pinchas. And the fig tree, the Midrash brings out, is a symbol of the Torah. Tending the fig tree, remember, and this is what Yeshua says to Nathanael. He says, Nati, I saw you when you were under the fig tree. This has a meaning to Nati, the same way that it does between Yehoshua and Moshe. To tend the fig tree is to behave as Yehoshua is thought to have behaved. He dedicated his life to serving Moses. And we know that Moses is a metaphor for the Torah. So Nathanael is a servant of the Torah. It said that Yehoshua arrived early and left late to the place of study. When the elders and the students would come in to learn from Moshe, that he would get there early, he would arrange everything, he would arrange the mats for the people to sit on. And the Midrash points out that a great teacher is first a devoted student. And it's not a devoted student who believes that this will help him advance over others. It's a student who is devoted to the learning itself. He is in pursuit of God. And that's what he's devoted to. Being advanced up the chain means nothing to him. He or she simply loves the Torah. And he or she loves the Torah so much because it's the words of God that they will forfeit what others would consider a normal life for it. He's the exact opposite of Korach. He has no hidden agenda. He has no dreams of greatness. And so the Midrash asks, why does the verse liken a Torah student to one who eats the fruit of a fig tree? It says, most trees bear their fruit all at one time. Fig trees, on the other hand, produce their fruit in staggered amounts. Therefore, figs must be picked at different times, each when it is ripe. The Torah is likened to a fig tree because one cannot become a wise student overnight. Rather, one must patiently and continuously invest years of study to become proficient in Torah. So what's the message that Yeshua is sending to Nati by saying, I saw you under the fig tree? He's recognizing something about Nati that he could not know unless there was a spirit upon him that allowed him to see across space and time. Nathanael was apparently a very devoted and zealous Torah student. In the Jewish tradition, he was the one who was eating of the fruit of the fig tree. He's tending the fig tree, and he's destined to eat the fruit of it. And so the siege of Jerusalem should have awakened the king to this understanding of the Torah portion, Pinchas, that, like it was said, the crown does not extend to all generations. That's what it says in Proverbs. That's in the context of the answer that Moses traditionally is said to have received concerning the fig tree. That Moses, it won't be your natural sons who carry on your work. It's going to be Yehoshua, that dedicated student of yours, the one who has served you faithfully all these years, expecting nothing in return. And so the king of Jerusalem does not have a son who wants to pursue the Torah with this same devotion and zeal. Therefore, the crown will not extend to his next generation. And there's some other principles he should have thought about. Not just that the crown may not endure to the next generation. He's not a king who's willing to both shepherd his people in Torah learning and repentance, as well as lead them out to battle. He doesn't have the shepherd's heart. Neither does he have the heart for battle. He's just hiding behind the walls. And in the process of building the walls, he's destroying the homes of Jerusalem. And so the obverse is true. If you tend the fruit of the fig tree, you're going to eat its fruit. But if you destroy the Torah, then you're also going to eat of the fruit of destruction. He doesn't have the zeal for the purity of the house. He has allowed the idolatry. He has allowed the abominations that cause desolation to be erected. And so because he didn't have zeal for the purity of the house, then he's not going to enjoy the fruit of the covenant of peace that was promised to Pinchas and his descendants. And remember, it was Joseph's purity that's considered his memorable attribute. Idolatry, sexual licentiousness bring destruction. And these are things we know about the 17th of Tammuz and hindsight. So if you want homework, here it is on the slides. And it's going to be based in the book of Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2. Okay. Basically through verse 17. And so here are the concepts that we can know about the 17th of Tammuz, plus the fast of the 7th month, which is the fast of Gedaliah. And I know we haven't covered that fast yet, so you may not really have the answers to that. But in a nutshell, or you can probably Wikipedia it, Gedaliah, after Jerusalem is conquered, the Babylonian king sets Gedaliah up as governor in Judah. there were Jews who were jealous of him, and they assassinate him. And their point is to rebel against the king of Babylon's authority. Even though Jeremiah told them, you're just going to have to deal with this 70 years of exile as punishment. And so they didn't accept that. It's just like with the 9th of Av coming up, commemorating the spies, he says, we can't go up, we can't do it. And then they change their minds and decide to go up, and they get completely destroyed in battle, right? They have to run away. Same thing happens with these rebels who assassinate Gedaliah, appointed by the king of Babylon. They try to go up without authority. Jeremiah has told them not to. And what they end up doing is failing miserable. And they end up in Egypt again. And so it marks a time, this last fast, the 3rd of Tishrei, it's going to mark the time of full dispersion from the land, which is very sad. So anyway, the points are on there for you, where you can look at them. And then what I want you to do, look at these points, and then work through that chapter of 1 Peter chapter 2. And then the homework is, in that passage from chapter 2 of 1 Peter, go through Peter's points and his advice and see how many points of correlation you can find to what you know now about the fasts of the 4th and the 7th months. And it was easier for me just to do it on a chart, just to go back and forth for the sake of organization. But you might think of a different way to set it up. And I know not everybody has a study partner that you can talk into it, but if you do, I would recommend again that you do it with a study partner so that you can bounce some ideas back and forth, and you may find additional points that I didn't even put on there. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And like I said, be looking for that live stream on Shabbat, because I'm going to have Keisha come in and we're going to try to get even a little deeper to get us ready for the next fast. Even if we weren't quite ready for this week and we missed this fast, or we didn't feel like we prepared enough, or we didn't know enough about what we were doing on this fast, we do have time to prepare for the 9th of Av. And so that's where we're headed.